Hello. Hello. Thank you very much for coming tonight. My name is Kathleen Quinn, and it's my honor to be the chair of the Edmonton Sexual Exploitation Working Group. This room was full today. We've had a very incredible day for our conference, Collaborating for Change. I just wonder who was here today for the whole day. If you could just raise your hands. Okay, that's great. So we have about a third of us were here during the day, and 2/3 of us are coming especially for tonight. I would like to, I'm just going to say a few words to begin with, and then we'll hear from Kathy King, our keynote speaker. And we have Chris Chang Yen Phillips with us tonight, who's going to be our moderator, because there'll be a time for question and answer or reflection. So that'll be essentially the frame of the night. Do feel free to help yourself to any refreshments, while I'm talking, and that's what we'll do. So we began today recognizing that our beautiful city of Edmonton rests on the traditional land of Treaty 6 territory. This is the traditional territory of the diverse Indigenous people whose ancestors' footsteps have marked this territory for centuries, including Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Nakota Sioux, Métis, and Inuit. And we're all here in Edmonton today dedicated to working together as diverse communities. Elder Betty Latender blessed the gathering, and we carry that blessing with us into this evening. The Sexual Exploitation Working Group is an Edmonton-based leadership group. We are concerned for those who are vulnerable to sexual exploitation, whether it's through age, financial desperation, migration, homelessness, prior childhood abuse or neglect, mental or physical health conditions, intergenerational trauma, addictions, or any other circumstances that contribute to vulnerability. We've been working together for over 12 years, and this will be the 11th year that we had a proclamation by our mayor. And the proclamation is standing over there if you would like to see it later. So our city proclaims a week of awareness of sexual exploitation. And on Monday night, our high-level bridge was lighted up orange to commemorate that. Now you may wonder, why orange? And you'll see that I'm wearing quite a bit of orange, and a few people in the room are as well. Orange is a color that's often associated with freedom movements. It symbolizes change, energy, and the warmth of compassion. Anti-human trafficking organizations around the world have chosen this color. And so we in Edmonton, we stand in solidarity this week by wearing orange throughout the week as we all work together to shape a community, a city, and a world that is free of sexual exploitation. On the left side of the stage there, you will see before you a vase of flowers. These flowers are a symbol of the more than 40 women who are known to be murder victims in our city in the last 35 years. I say known because there are many whose deaths were undetermined causes, there were many others who died of suicide, who died of illness or addictions. Of the 40 known women who were murdered, only 11 murderers have been found. So there are many families left wondering, who killed my loved one? We want to remember all those who died, because it is in remembering that we make a commitment and we're compelled to take action, to keep creating a community where people are women, children, men are not murdered in our community. So it's that act of remembrance that is so important. It also moves us forward to support those who are alive today and who are struggling. And part of our work is to create pathways out of exploitation and to foster hope. You'll see before you a red dress here and some of the posters here, the red dress posters. This is a photography project that was initiated by Mufti Mathewson, who's here with us tonight. And a number of photographers got together and have taken these photos. There's an explanation about the Red Dress Project. I think a photography project, what moves me is that it's Mufti started with, what can I do? What can I do as one woman in Edmonton in response to the overwhelming knowledge that so many of our Indigenous sisters have been murdered. We know also that throughout our country there are many different expressions of the Red Dress Project. And I would like to just note that in my own community, where are the CEAS offices on 118th Avenue, members of the Anglican community created a memorial as well that was up for a month. And we have some of the people who were involved with that tonight. So I think this is a very important expression of our collective grief that will keep moving us to action. In 1998, I was speaking at MacEwan University, and I was speaking about the John School, because it had just started in 1996 as a community expression of, we have to do something to stop the harm that is happening to so many and impacting so many city center communities. And a woman came up to me and she said, I want to come speak to those men. And I said, well, why do you want to come to speak to the John School? Because as my role as facilitator, I have to be a little bit protective of the program, and I didn't know who she was. So she said, well, I'm Kathy King. And I said, oh, Kara's mother. Because I had remembered August 1997, I was working at Kindred House, a drop-in resource center, and we were in the main floor of our WEAC, the Women's Emergency Accommodation Shelter, and I had remembered the posters. And I said, of course, come. So that was 1998, and Kathy has been educating men, building empathy. She has been educating the community. She is a social worker, has her master's in social work. She counsels other people. She gathers people. She builds community. And we invited her to come tonight to share her experiences. She's titled her presentation, From Personal to Political, My Journey with Sexual Exploitation. Welcome, Kathy.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been a long day. I was one of the ones that was here at 7 o'clock this morning, and oh my gosh. And I know we were expecting lots and lots of people tonight. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good, thank you. And I've been writing this talk like for a month, so I'm not even sure if I'm going to say it all, but I'll start where I decided to start, because this is what happens if I don't write things down. I tend to ramble, and I don't like to do that. So before we begin, I also want to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, and I did a little bit of research about that. So the treaties began in 1871 in what is now southern Manitoba, extended north, east, and west over the next few years. The land covered by Treaty 6 stretches across central Alberta and Saskatchewan, and prior, well, I thought, what I learned was that prior to 1876, it was occupied primarily by the Cree. What I've learned today, in fact, is that it was occupied by many more people as well. The First Nations people gave up custody or customary title to the land in exchange for the provisions promised by the government. And interesting, I always like to do historical perspectives. Slavery had just been abolished in the United States a decade previously. So not surprisingly, there is now discussion about whether the transactions of the treaties were fully understood by the First Nations people. The Encyclopedia of Saskatchewan suggests the semantic difference between the languages and cultures may well have been too vast for even the best translator to bridge. So that we know what that means. The Native people had no idea what giving up the land meant, even though those were the words that were translated. And what that struck me about that is that we seem to be facing a similar problem today in dealing with the issues of sexual exploitation. I believe that most citizens want to protect the rights and freedoms of women and want to keep children safe, yet so many people are unaware of the vast and growing exploitation stretching around the world. We are often unaware of what we can do, and those who do try to speak often become polarized over semantics, and that is the tragedy of our discussion. So I take that risk with my own words. Being asked to speak on any occasion is a very humbling experience. As a social worker and counselor, most of my career has been spent listening. And as an introvert, I'm most comfortable in my internal world and find my truth in silence and reflection. So although I speak from my own experiences, I have also tried to incorporate the listening that I've done and incorporate other people's perspectives. When I first began speaking on this subject about 20 years ago, I often felt like a lone voice because I was doing advocacy even before my daughter died, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Today, I hope we are mostly like-minded and that I may simply add strength to some of your voices. I believe in the willingness of most citizens to move forward together for the collective good of society. The well-known poet and activist Maya Angelou said, "When we know better, we do better." And so what I'm doing is sharing some of the experiences that help me know better. And I hope my words can help make a difference to you. I also want to acknowledge, as Kate has done, the many red dress projects that represent the missing and murdered women of Canada. And my daughter, as you've heard, is one of those who disappeared from the street and whose life was taken far too soon. Her name was Cara, which meant beloved or friend. She loved red dresses, and it was often one of her favorite Christmas traditions to receive a new dress for the season. And I still have her last red dress. So I place it beside me to honor her life as I speak in her memory. I'm also wearing red tonight to honor all of the missing and murdered women of Canada. So I bucked the crowd, I didn't wear orange. And also to honor what they used to call the Scarlet Women, who were so often chastised in history. And I speak humbly, I hope, on their behalf, choosing to see them as vulnerable and victimized. Recently, someone asked, why do I care about what others do behind closed doors? And I had to think about that, and I really need to clarify that I have no intention of interfering with freely chosen activities between mutually consenting adults. So when you say you don't care, then you have to say what you do care about. So I do care about the protection of children who may be neglected or abused or sexualized or raised with ridicule and contempt, and I speak for their protection. I do care about adults who face economic disparity, abuse, degradation, hopelessness, and exploitation, and I speak for their freedom and equality. I care about the damages of objectification and pornography and trafficking in a society that seems to have lost touch with its human spirit, and I speak for our restoration. I care that our world seems more focused on consumerism than philanthropy, and I will speak to defend the basic rights of all citizens, especially those unable to speak for themselves. Over the next while, I want to explore the 4 directions of the medicine wheel as I have learned from my own research and meditation. So I've done a little kind of medicine wheel interpretation. I apologize in advance if my interpretations contradict other traditions, but although it is also said there's no wrong way to build a wheel, so my wheel's kind of stretched out for you there. In my understanding, the medicine wheel is a symbol of the interaction and connection of all life on earth. Time and space are circular, sacred and life are one. All power comes from the Creator at the center of the unbroken circle. As days and seasons mark the changes of time, There is an endless connection to past, present, and future. The four directions reach to embrace all peoples on Mother Earth. Medicine wheel teachings are about walking the earth in a peaceful way with strong bodies, hearts, minds, and spirits to balance the journey of creation, the seasons of life, and the elements of fire, earth, water, and air. In the beginning, in the morning of our life, our physical body is formed from a spark of energy symbolized by the sun. That's the yellow color. This is the time of youth, of planting and seeding. It is natural that children are spontaneous, enthusiastic, and creative as they awaken to their individual and unique potential. In the daytime of our life, we have family, where our collective heart is grounded and symbolized by Mother Earth. This is a time of development and abundance. We learn about integrity and honesty in relationships as we grow to become adults and parents. In the evening of our life, we embrace community and harvest. The integrity and maturity of our collective mind is symbolized by the essential refreshment of water. That's the blue color. This is the time for gratitude and discernment, reflecting and healing, for exploring ideas and learning to communicate. As warriors, we claim our vision of unity under one Creator. And finally, as night descends, we become elders and grandparents in our spirit time. We make peace and become one with the breath of life. This is a time of acceptance and rest. We pass into the world of dreams and hope the winds of our wisdom will guide new generations. Disruption to these natural rhythms results in trauma that needs to be healed. Children born into unhappy and abusive circumstances do not know how to become nurturing and protective parents. Adults who are not grounded in respectful and caring relationships may not be able to contribute constructively to their community. Warriors without a clear vision of caring can become angry and destructive. I think we've all known some of them. And elders who have not made peace with their lives are not able to offer others hope. I attended a cultural awareness workshop many years ago where one of the participants asked if all people become elders in the First Nations tradition. The leader replied, "Oh no, some just become old people." Those words have always remained with me. So my warrior years are over for the most part. I've contributed as well as I knew how, and I'm ready to let others take charge. My last wish is to be peaceful and wise, and maybe inspire the spirit of those going forward. When I was asked for a title last month, I chose From Personal to Political to reflect the journey of my own life. 40 years ago, I gave birth to a beautiful, innocent daughter and was delighted to watch her grow and develop. 20 years ago, I found myself in shock and disbelief, trying to understand the circumstances that had captured her and my inability to help her find a way out. I have since chosen to advocate for a greater understanding and better services on behalf of all vulnerable people, so that my daughter's life might have meaning and other lives might be saved. So now I'd like to take a little bit more time about each direction. So going to the first quarter. What about the circumstances of our birth? The East is the season of creation. The eagle, spirit-minded of the earth, represents clarity and vision. The earth rises, the sun rises. The sun rises and a new day begins. The eagle flies high in the sky, close to Creator, and sees a wide perspective. The sun warms the earth and gives energy to creation. East is the beginning of all new things as people embrace their missions of love and service to each other. And I need to tell you a story. I have the most amazing little granddaughter. I'm probably going to get emotional. She's 5 years old, and she brought her little doll for a visit the other day. And I had to look at the doll, and as she's holding her little doll, she says, "Look at her. She was just born, and she's just perfect, just like me. I was just perfect when I was born." And I thought, well, kudos to her mom for teaching her that. But that is the most basic truth, that we are all born perfect. We all have challenges to meet as we grow, and we're all worthy of love and respect. Spring is the time of unlimited potential, and I'm always amazed by the diversity and power of human achievements. In our recorded history, we have evolved into explorers who search and discover new lands, doctors who learn to heal the human body, astronomers who explore the reaches of the universe, writers and poets who create language to record our history and deepest feelings, artists and musicians who continually develop new expressions of beauty and wonder, farmers and ranchers who cultivate crops and raise animals to provide food for the world, scientists who discover new and exciting inventions, parents and teachers who inspire young children and challenge bright minds to greater achievements, leaders who guide their countries and communities in peace and prosperity, and so on. The complex tapestry of our universal culture never ceases to amaze me. Excuse me. And yet, as the eagle circles today, as it has for every generation of new birth, the eagle also sees shadows in the light of day. Unfortunately, disease, greed, violence, and oppression provide obstacles that impede our natural drives for protection and creativity. And I was doing some research over 100 years ago in the early 1990s, when Edmonton was still in its infancy. There was great controversy about tolerance of booze and brothels in the growing cities across the prairies. The settlements were populated by large numbers of single laborers from railroad and construction work, and enforcement in those days seemed to be as much double talk as it is today. For the most part, controlled tolerance seemed to be the norm, with concerns expressed appropriately about the activity of pimps and the recruitment of underage girls. One of my favorite quotes from Red Lights on the Prairies, this is a book that was written in 1973, when he's describing an unsuccessful crackdown in 1912-13. So the author states, in 1914, word went out that Edmonton was back in business and the underworld scum quickly moved in to take advantage. And I wonder if a similar risk is not present today. It is well known that traffickers, like all criminals, tend to go where profit is high and resistance low. In countries where exploitation is tolerated, many more vulnerable people are victimized and put at risk. I would like to quote statistics produced by a nonprofit organization called Equality Now, and it's easy to access. The numbers are staggering. At least 20.9 adults and children are bought and sold worldwide into commercial servitude and forced labor. Between 20 and 80% of those are used as sex slaves. They didn't get the city memo. That would be 12 to 18 million adults trapped in sexual servitude and about 2 million children exploited each year in the global commercial sex trade. The crime of trafficking happens everywhere. United Nations display wonderful flow charts with 150 citizenships identified in 124 countries. The primary source areas are South America, Africa, East Asia, and Eastern Europe, where poverty is prevalent. The primary destination countries are North and Central America, Europe, and the Middle East. And there's all kinds of colorful bar charts and flow arrows that simply reinforce that crime moves where profit is high and detection low. By simple math, a few years ago, I divided the number of adult men in the world by the number of estimated customers and came up with 15%. That would be approximately 1 out of 7 men who contribute to the exploitation of women by purchasing the use of their bodies. We know from stories of survivors, the men indulge in a range of debasing and disgusting activities that could hardly even be called sex. We cannot let this minority define our culture. 2 questions come to mind. Why do men buy sex? And secondly, why are some groups targeted more than others, some groups of women? The Guardian magazine in January 2010 reported an earlier study indicating the amount of men paying for sex had doubled in a decade. That's kind of scary. This was attributed simply to the greater acceptance of commercial contact. And the reasons are interesting. One man blamed, appropriately, cruelty and neglect in childhood for his inability to form close relationships with women. Another wanted to receive pleasure without any expectation of reciprocity. It was not a deterrent for men in this study to learn that women were trafficked, pimped, or coerced. Another interesting finding was that many believed they would need to rape if they could not get sex on demand. There were others who seemed to want a real relationship, and yet others again who made it quite clear that they wanted to control the encounters so they could do things that real women would not tolerate. Another study of 700 men by ABC News, also 2010, reported similar findings. Many wanted to satisfy an immediate sexual urge. Some wanted certain stereotypes, such as submissiveness. Many were unsatisfied with their current relationships, and others wanted no emotional commitment. And these stories pretty much reflect the stories we've heard from the John Schools over the years. We've had 20 years of John School and approximately 2,800 men who've attended the program. These were men who had been arrested for communicating in public and chose to partake. This was an alternative measures program, so the men had the option of attending the program rather than attending court. Men who frequented body rub or escort agencies were not arrested because negotiating in private was not illegal. Communicating in public was illegal. So we had a limited range of offenders, but that's how the John School started. The second, and I'll talk a little bit more about that again later. The second question is why women get involved, and of those presumed to be voluntary, some survivors of child sexual abuse said they felt better at least being paid for what had previously been taken. Some were caught up in life on the street and lured by seemingly quick money. Others saw an alternative to menial, low-paying jobs. And these ladies, the voluntary ladies, the so-called voluntary ladies, are merely the tip of the iceberg. What we also know is that those who are public we can't get distracted by them because there is so much more that is underground that is not known. And just like we know, like we see a little bit of the iceberg, there's so much that we don't see. So the ladies that we have the information on are largely the tip of the iceberg. The more insidious dynamics are the pimps, the traffickers who enslave women and children around the world for profit. From the beginning of time, there have been these despicable men who treat other human beings as objects for sale and abuse. Most often, countries and conditions of poverty are targeted, with some parents even coerced to sell their children for a promise of a better life. This is the world into which our perfect children are born, with a 15% chance that the men in their lives will buy them, sell them, or exploit them. So moving along, I'd like to talk a little bit about the family. The spirit animal for the South, the season of emotional grounding, is the mouse, reminding us we must pay attention to small details. The mouse works hard and multiplies. The nucleus of a family unit is where we first expect to experience love, acceptance, and belonging. Parenting, as many of us know, is often the greatest joy and biggest challenge we face. A tiny, helpless infant is placed in our arms, and we are given the task of supporting and guiding that child into adulthood. We all want our children to grow up free, healthy, strong, and independent. And as we progress along that journey, we become painfully aware of our own limitations and realize that our love is sometimes not enough. So I was thinking about my own life, and I'll just share a little bit about my own story. 1976, so I was thinking, where was my family? At the time Treaty 6 was signed, 1876, my grandparents were not yet born in England. My father's father came to Canada as a young man in 1909 to join his older brother in settling a homestead. And I remember my grandparents as gracious and gentle people. So then I wonder, how did trauma and exploitation end up in my life? So I eliminate my paternal grandparents. My mother's family, on the other hand, had a much more rowdy history with addictions and abuse prevalent through the generations. And it seemed from an early age I was aware of this historical dichotomy and the potential effect on parenting, although I didn't put it in those words at the time. Nevertheless, I grew up in relative innocence and vaguely remember hearing about girls for sale at the local town pool hall, and I didn't even know what that meant. Another time, as a young adult, I ventured downtown during a visit to Edmonton. I lived in a rural area. I heard there were great bargains at the Army and Navy, and I took a bus from my aunt's on the south side. And remember that on the 3 blocks from Jasper Avenue to the Army and Navy store, I was asked 3 times if I wanted a date. And even then, I didn't realize what I was being asked. Later, as a working single parent, balancing car payments and daycare and student loans, I lived next door to another mom with a little girl. Our daughters were good friends and spent a lot of time in each other's homes, and I was curious that the other mom received welfare, but always seemed to have a slightly higher level of income than I did. We had similar cars, but she had the sports model. She went on holidays. She had better furniture and lots of little things that I couldn't afford. The reason I learned was that she always had a few regulars on the side. She explained to me how she made them feel good, and in return they gave her money or other gifts that she simply exchanged for money. And I found her situation more fascinating than offensive at the time. We were both working in our own way to pay the rent and feed our children. And I realize now that hers, again, I talked about the tip of the iceberg. Her situation was the tip of the iceberg, seemingly harmless, but distracting from the more sinister reality. Many years later, I met another young woman who had grown up in that neighborhood just down the street. She told me stories of her father bringing friends home from the bar at night to molest her. But then I had heard many such stories and was a little less naive. But I remain troubled to this day to remember that lady and the terrible things that happened to her while I lived unsuspectingly a block away. So that was just one street in Edmonton in a comfortable middle-class Southside community in the late 1970s. We had a part-time sex worker, I guess, next door, and a sexually exploited little girl down the block. I suppose my neighbor could have been called an independent escort. She was certainly not licensed, nor was she underground. She seemed to have her choice of customers and did not appear to put herself in danger. The little girl down the block was invisible. Just over 10 years later, it was still the biggest shock of my life to realize my daughter was caught up in this world I still didn't understand. She first disappeared at age 16, towards the end of grade 10, after going to stay with a new friend. Tension had been high at home due to her late nights, skipping school, partying, experimenting with drugs and alcohol, etc. And my rule at the time was that she not come home drunk or stoned. That was my way of coping, so she often stayed away on weekends. A few days later, I received a message on my answering machine that she had been seen working downtown. I drove around a few times looking for her to no avail. I phoned an outreach agency several times. My calls were not returned. That was 1991, and I didn't know what to do. Hopefully there would be more resources today. Fortunately, at the time, she had good friends. She had bad friends, but she also had good friends. She had good friends who took matters into their own hands. They found her one night, picked her up, and brought her home. She said she'd been kidnapped. And I still find it hard to wrap my head around that, and I realized I wasn't given full information. So after her rescue, we endured a few weeks of intrusive phone calls, people inviting her to Vancouver, ringing the doorbell at strange hours, surrounding the apartment building. Thankfully, we did live in a secure building at the time, and eventually the harassment passed. So that was in Edmonton. That was downtown Edmonton. I still didn't know how to talk to her, and she didn't really want to talk, so we carried on. I found out later that the outreach agency did have contact with her during that time, and I can't help thinking that a follow-up call with a referral for debriefing or specialized counseling might have been helpful. She returned to school, but she still had friends that I wasn't quite happy with, and the people she brought home were such that I often felt at risk in my own apartment. We did have a month of relative reprieve, the reprieve being that she quit bugging me for money, and she told me she had a catering job with a friend. And I remembered having a catering job when I was in high school, so I didn't really think anything of it. And my naivety was once again challenged when she told me much later that the job had been serving topless. And I'm still incredulous to this day. that there was a place in the city where men would pay to be served drinks by topless underage teenagers. This is not okay. Eventually, I asked her to find alternative accommodation, and I agreed to support her as long as she stayed in school. For this, I was labeled codependent, so it's not always easy being a parent. She stayed with friends for a year and later found a small bachelor apartment. By then, her life was starting to unravel as she began to experience psychiatric symptoms from drug use. She became increasingly paranoid and inappropriate with periods of catatonia and raging, and she was admitted to hospital at age 20. I was told she had dual diagnosis, the dual diagnosis being psychiatric and addictive processes interfering with each other. This is a challenging situation for both clinicians and family members. Much more work is still needed regarding outpatient follow-up and residential alternatives for that population. The next 2 years were marked by a series of hospitalizations, detox center, incarcerations, women emergency shelter, cheap hotels, and dingy apartments shared with her boyfriend. I tried to maintain regular contact with her to help her access what services were available and to provide a bridge back to my world in case she was able or chose to return. During this time as well, one of her supposed friends pushed her to get money, and so she became a source of income for a group of pathetic parasites. She and her boyfriend were involved with drugs. Sometimes he looked after her, and sometimes she looked after him. My biggest realization after it was all over is that my frustration was secondary to hers. She was the one living with developmental delays, addictions, mental illness, and homelessness, punished by society for her inadequacies and exploited to support her lifestyle. I remember asking one day what she wanted from life, and her answer was that she wanted her own place where she could have a couch and a TV and some pictures on the wall. And I hold my head in shame on behalf of society that there was no one and no way that that simple wish could be granted. Most would consider that a basic human right. She was deprived of security because of her inability to provide for herself, although her behaviors by then were far beyond informed and conscious choice. Then one night she disappeared. The police in 1997 would not file a missing person report, much less investigate. I found out she had been on a list of high-risk registry of the outreach agency maintained for the sole purpose of identifying victims. Her decomposed body was found in a field 4 weeks later, and on the red chair is the picture on the front page of the journal the next day. The outreach agency sent flowers. Global TV recently produced a commentary called Forgotten Voices. One of the officers from Project CARE was interviewed, and she was here, Violet was here this morning. She said most of the girls she meets on the street still feel unwanted, unloved, and unneeded. When asked where they saw themselves in 5 years, they responded dead. Many still see no other way out. So I'd like to tell you a few stories about some of the other women I met who have survived. My friend Juanita is here. She's a few years older than my daughter and grew up in a very chaotic home. She is a woman of two nations, Cree and Black, and was raised by her Black grandmother. And you know what? And Juanita, I even had to ask Andrea, I said, is this Juanita's line? Because I think I've heard it more than once. And she said, yeah, no, I've heard Juanita say that, so I think it's okay to say it. Okay, you remember being told as a child, you're sitting on a gold mine, baby, you'll never go hungry. And yeah, so you were molested by your mother's boyfriends and many other men who came to your house. It's been an honor for me over the years to bear witness with Juanita. We often do tag team on presentations. To bear witness to her story of how childhood trauma and the terrible choices she had to make to survive. It is hard to imagine that a child could be left in a house with no food, that a child could be found assaulted on the road and returned home without treatment or follow-up, that a child could be taken into care and returned over and over again to abusive and addictive parents, or that a child could be delivered to a neighborhood pervert and become hooked on drugs without anyone noticing. Juanita survived 22 terrible years on the street and has since, 28? Pardon me. 28 years and has since made a better life for herself. She's an educator with CEASE and reaches out to other young women at risk for exploitation. I have so much admiration for the survivors I met over the years, and my heart aches for them as I listen to their stories of recovery. Another young woman asked, "Why shouldn't I be paid? I work hard." When I asked her to explain, she said she promises discretion and she makes her customers feel good about themselves. That's the ultimate girlfriend experience, which some Johns also want. This lady operated through her phone and said she always chose men who were married and employed because they were less likely to do anything to put their family or their job at risk. I also met a young man recently who worked as a limo driver in Fort McMurray. So I said, "Oh, how interesting. Tell me about Fort McMurray." So he said, "Oh, women fly in from all over because there's lots of single men there who are known to pay well." And I thought, well, that's a really interesting scenario. Business is good enough that women treat themselves to limos, or maybe that's just a perk they give themselves to take the edge off what they're doing. Dissociation, moving along, is a psychological process of banishing traumatic events from consciousness by shutting down emotionally. Fragmentation and identity confusion are exactly the way another woman from Edmonton described her experience. She is beautiful, articulate, ambitious, and became involved a few years ago to get out of debt. She said at the time, "Rub and tug, how bad can it be?" She quickly found out that it was indeed much worse. She was told if she wanted money, her job was to allow herself to be violated, customer after customer, no matter how disgusting or demeaning their requests. She later described it as telling a lie many times each day and every day. She lied to the men that she enjoyed her job and each was her favorite customer. Yet every time she was violated, it was as if a piece of her broke off and was replaced only by the memory of the abuse. She said she lost so many pieces, she didn't know who she was anymore. And that kind of dissociation is often correlated with sexual exploitation. And I want to quote from Rachel Moran, she is a remarkable survivor who visited Edmonton in November of last year, 2015, and this is the book she wrote called Paid For. Did anybody hear? There's a few people here that heard Rachel. She was okay. This was the most impactful book that I have read in a long time. So I just want to share a few words from there, describing that dissociation experience. Now we have to remember that she was somebody who made it out, and she was somebody who had the power of articulation. So we can only imagine how much worse it is for people who haven't made it out and who don't know how to put their experiences into words. So what Rachel says is, because you continually deny your own feelings, you come to have a very traumatic relationship with yourself. And sometimes that causes the real self to become very obscure. There is a sincere danger in that because when you become obscure to yourself, you have lost the ability to ask yourself questions. I wouldn't have known in my teens that the duplicity, loneliness, and confusion I was experiencing and witnessing came about as a result of an unnatural separation of myself. At times, I've asked myself, who was I anymore? Am I still myself? What is left of me now? I am taking the long way back because there is no short way, and it is sad to find myself on a journey that takes me in a direction I want to go, but which I know will never end. This is not melodrama, it is fact. How could it be possible to complete a journey when you do not know the landscape of your destination? You can't any more than you'd recognize a city you've never been to, and anyway, it's probably just as well because you're never going to get there. The you that you are is the one that exists. You're never going to know the you that would have existed in some parallel universe you can't access. What I do recognize, and this is a great blessing, are the little milestones along the way, towards the self I should, might, would otherwise have been. I haven't got there, but I moved towards there, and there is clear progress in the moving. They are not always dramatic, these milestones. In fact, the journey is usually marked by mundane and commonplace things. So I am thankful for all of those who have survived, and I can only imagine how hard the journey is for them. And as an aside, I just want to say I took it upon myself to provide all the city councilors of Edmonton with a copy of this book along with the covering letter, and I am working my way through all of Thank you. I'm working my way through all the other politicians. I got 2 thank yous from the city out of 14, and I haven't had any responses from the federal politicians yet. Costs money to mail these things, so that's why I deliver them, and I'm planning to deliver them to a number of the provincial politicians as soon as time opens up. So I need to take a drink of water. Is everybody okay? It's been a lot of talking. Okay, we're past the halfway point. Moving on to my third chair. Okay, community. The spirit animal for the West is the bear. The element is water. Autumn is the season of mind, of mental and communal development. The bear is characterized by reflection and introspection as it hibernates for half the year after filling itself. In autumn, we seek to go deep within ourselves to heal what is necessary. This is also the time of warriors. There is so much more to do than any person will ever have time to do, and there is no perfect place to start. We are all called, sometimes by circumstances we do not choose, to make the world a better place. What is important is that we pay attention to opportunities for learning and continue to move in a positive direction. Residential schools were sanctioned by the Indian Act of 1876 as a means of assimilating children into the Euro-Canadian and supposedly Christian-dominant culture. It was supposed to be a good thing at the time. We must keep that in mind as people today argue the pros and cons of legislation about buying and selling sex. In retrospect, we know residential schools were seen as instruments of cultural genocide, where many students suffered horrendous abuse. Likewise, many citizens today are blind to the abuses of sexual exploitation in a commercially and otherwise, and I trust that we will be judged harshly by history. I would like us to change it before then. The Indigenous Foundations of the University of British Columbia provided the following observation. The extent to which government or church officials knew of abuses has been debated, yet those who spoke out and called for reform were generally met with silence and lack of support, end quote. I think there's many of us in this room who can relate to that. And maybe that some former students had fond memories of their time at residential school, just as there are a few women who claim to be empowered by doing sex work. But even those good experiences happened within a destructive system that contributed to the sense of worthlessness and low self-esteem, resulting in alcoholism, substance abuse, and suicide. And this can also be said of commercial sexual exploitation. Many survivors say a bad day straight is still better than a good day working. We know that change takes time, and I am encouraged by the many sparks of hope over the last 30 years. Positive initiatives have taken place locally and around the world to help raise awareness of the harm associated with sexual exploitation and to build supports for those involved. I tried to summarize some of these highlights, but there are far too many to discuss. So I have a list, of 3 pages or 4 pages that I can make available if people want it, or I guess it's recorded. So I'm just going to skim through it because I was so impressed, of all the things that have happened since 1982 in Edmonton and around the world. There's a lot of signs of hope. But we need to keep the momentum going. It is significant since 1892, prostitution, which I do not like that word, this is the only time I'm going to use it, it was defined as the exchange of sex for money, and it was not addressed in statute law. Only the related activities were regulated: owning a bawdy house, procuring, and soliciting in public. So two significant events happened about 30 years ago. 1982, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms allowed the provision for challenging the constitutionality of laws. Now, this wasn't really an event, but I have a collection of information. In 1984, the Edmonton Journal published a documentary on children selling sex in Edmonton. And it was significant, I think, because this was the beginning of a large number of social initiatives prompted by concerned citizens. So we have the safe houses were developed, a number of avenues were designated one way in the high traffic areas to deter the circulating traffic of Johns. The street works began a needle exchange. There was more safe housing. In 1996, Kate alluded to this, the first prostitution offender program, known as the John School, was held through the collaborative action, community members, police, Crown prosecutors, and others. In 1977, CEASE, it was known as PAFE then, CEASE was established as a nonprofit organization to disperse the funds received from the prostitution offender program back to harmed communities. So this was significant. 1999, locally, there was the protection of sexually abused children. Back then, it was also called the protection of children involved in prostitution, but they too appropriately changed their name to recognize that children, anyone under 18, was recognized as a victim of child sexual abuse and could not considered to have made a lifestyle choice as was treated previously. 1999, on the international stage, this was mentioned today, Sweden was the first country in the world to introduce legislation prohibiting the purchase of sexual services. If you can imagine how groundbreaking that was at the time. And I remember reading this article and I said, oh my God, there is a country in the world that has introduced legislation prohibiting the purchase of sexual services. I was amazed. This is what we call the Nordic model. It's spreading, it's growing, and I like the momentum. 2003, RCMP Project CARE was established because, as was also alluded, we have lots and lots and lots of missing and murdered women at that time. Some obviously related to the, probably many related to sexual exploitation. There's some we don't know for sure. Jumping along, 2008, Norway became the second country in the world to adopt the Nordic model. 2009, Iceland adopted the Nordic model, and I'm leaving out, I have to mention, 2006, the first memorial march for missing and murdered women of Edmonton. So we've had 11 marches now. This was patterned after the marches that were held in Vancouver. There's one of the posters, that's marched a few times for the memorial marches. So there's, we're moving into a political stance. 2009, there was, legislation introduced around trafficking. 2009, the first charges of trafficking were laid in Edmonton and Calgary. I brought one more. Show and tell. 2010, the Johns. This is it's just more detail. It's a comprehensive study looking at the Johns. Who are the men who buy sex? Victor Malarek estimates 1 of 9 Canadian men buy sex. This is a little bit lower than what I consider the world average, but that's possible because we know that in some countries where sexual exploitation has been around for centuries, there is much higher use. So he says 1 out of 9 Canadian males. He also states, interestingly, that 96% of the women that he's talked to would rather be doing something else with their bodies in their life. So we talk about that, the empowered, the vocal minority who say who say they like it, that's fine. They're 4%. We had, remember the iceberg. 2011, we got our new name as CEASE, and I remember I was so happy when we finally got a new name, because somebody once said to me, "Oh, prostitution awareness. So are you for it or against it?" I thought, okay, we need a name that's a little more clear. We got it. We are against sexual exploitation. Pardon me, that was the second time I used that word. It's a word I do not like to use. 2013. Okay, and then I have to admit that I got a little bit confused there, because it's so hard to keep track of everything. 2013, the lady who spoke from Quebec, or from Montreal, wherever, she talked about the Bradford challenge. In 2013, after 3 years of challenges and appeals, and I know I got totally confused during this time. I think Kate was tracking it all. She was going to meetings. Anyway, the Supreme Court struck down 3 sections of the criminal code, i.e. the only 3, the bawdy house, living off the avails, and soliciting, and gave the government a year to come up with new legislation. 2014, the city declared a temporary moratorium on opening new body rub facilities pending further study. So 2014, December 6, 2014, a year and a half ago already, Peter MacKay, Bill 36, the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, came into effect in Canada. The preamble states, "The Parliament of Canada has grave concerns about exploitation and recognizes the social harm caused by objectification of the human body and commodification of sexual activity. The law seeks to reduce the harm by targeting those who buy sex." So it's a version of the Nordic model that came to Canada in 2014. And again, I remember I was skeptical, and I thought, oh my God, is this just another interim provision? Are we going to have to go through this again in another year? I can't keep track. And I remember talking to Joyce Smith, who was here, and I said, is this real? And she says, oh yes, this is federal legislation. It is real. It is in place unless the government changes it. So I'm thinking, oh my God, I can't believe this is true. The voices of justice have been heard. Canada is joining the forward-thinking countries around the world in an innovative step to combat sexual exploitation. 2014, Northern Ireland also joined the Nordic model. And 2015, I have to mention, there was a Premier Wynne in Ontario, requested a review of the legislation at the request of some of her Toronto councillors or somebody who wanted to stay in the business. It was found constitutional, and Premier Wynne said it will be enforced in Ontario. I haven't been following that up. 2015, Mayor Don Iveson was quoted by the Edmonton Sun as saying, "If we could pass a bylaw that ended sexual exploitation, I would." So that's why I was totally blindsided a couple months ago when I received notice that the city body rub bylaws were up for review. And I had somehow thought it was old news. We had a moratorium. We had, I didn't even mention, the parliamentary studies started in 2005, I think. We had 10 years of study at a parliamentary level. We had new federal legislation. We had a moratorium in Edmonton. We had a constitutional review in Ontario. We seemed to have political will from the mayor, but that wasn't enough. Somehow, the city's legal department decided as long as everybody pretended body rub was not about social services, they could proceed. And I have trouble understanding this, so I would encourage you to talk to your own councillors and see if you can have anybody they all explain, oh, this is a harm reduction. So if that makes sense to anybody, fine. If it doesn't make sense to you, please ask your councillor to explain it. The City Social Services Committee recommended that facilities and practitioners be licensed to perform erotic massages, and this decision is, Scott McKean, those of you who heard him here, said, oh, this was such a difficult decision, council really struggled with it, but they somehow managed to pass it unanimously in spite of their struggles. And that's where we stand right now. The city is back in business. So much work has been done in Edmonton over the last 30 years. I'm not sure present council or many citizens for that matter appreciate what a long and tedious struggle this has been. Although the city's recent decision feels like a step backward, the work must continue. And as I mentioned to a few people, I came out of retirement to add my voice one last time, and I've been practicing saying that with a smile, because when people ask me how I'm doing, and if I say like I'm really upset about the city's recent decision, and if I say it in an angry voice, then that turns people off. So I have to say it, yeah, okay, like I came out of retirement, I was doing other things, I was trying to move into my elder stage. I got called back in a warrior stage, and then I still get in a warrior stance sometimes, and then I get into trouble. But we do have to remember, well, there's two things we have to remember. The vocal minority of practitioners who support being licensed are, in fact, only a tip of the iceberg. They represent maybe 2 to 8% of all sellers. The vast majority of sexual exploitation is coercive and demeaning. I believe we can do better as a community. Poor and marginalized women have the right to better options than those offered by abusive men. Our conversations need to expand into many yet unexplored dimensions. So they are the tip of the iceberg, the licensed people are the tip of the iceberg, but I believe they're giving a wrong message. Okay, finally, the fourth direction, spirit and consciousness. I better take a drink of water. The north season of winter is our spirit time, a time of peace and freedom, of deep connection with the understanding of life. This is represented by the great buffalo. I had to go with a beanie bag buffalo, but anyway, which faces a storm solidly and directly, headfirst and steadfast. As elders and grandparents, we move beyond our warrior stance to freedom and personal power. Oh, and I want to read one more quote. And this is from probably the most amazing book I had read until I read Paid For. This is Trauma and Recovery, written by Judith Herman in 1992. So that's almost 25 years ago already. And one of her teachings is that the ability to formulate and articulate a position about social and political violence is an essential part of society's recognition of and response to trauma. We who deal with sexual exploitation are, for the most part, dealing with people who have been deeply traumatized. So I'll just, a two-paragraph quote from Judith Herman. And she's going back, she wrote her book 25 years ago, as I said. Only after 1980, when the efforts of combat veterans had legitimized the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, did it become clear that the psychological syndrome seen in survivors of rape, domestic battery, and incest was essentially the same as the syndrome seen in survivors of war. The implications of this insight are as horrifying in the past as they were a century ago. The subordinate condition of women is maintained and enforced by the hidden violence of men. There is war between the sexes. But history teaches us that this knowledge could also disappear. Without the context of a political movement, it has never been possible to advance the study of psychological trauma. The fate of this field of knowledge depends on the fate of the same political movement that has inspired and sustained it over the last century. In the last 19th century, the goal of that movement was the establishment of secular democracy. In the earliest 20th century, it was the abolition of war. In the late 20th century, its goal was liberation of women. All of these goals remain. All are, in the end, inseparably connected. So sexual exploitation was not mentioned specifically 25 years ago, and now that we are in the early 21st century, I would like to suggest that our goal must include the abolition of the growing traffic in human persons. We must find new words to redefine sexual equality and freedom as basic human rights, and we must embrace new concepts to respect the integrity of the human body. Part of our work will always be helping women recover. Those who have been traumatized can spend a long time in the state of shock, fear, and confusion. On another level, however, our more challenging work is changing the hearts and minds of men. As discussed earlier, there are many reasons little boys may grow up to be men who buy sex. We tend to tolerate huge power imbalances in society. We tend to blame victims for their own misfortune, and we often take refuge in silence rather than speaking out. It is time to speak. We know there are many predisposing factors to vulnerability. We know that trauma can impair cognitive development. Like domestic violence, sexual exploitation is driven by men who lack empathy and somehow justify their entitlement to treat women as objects. Some of the stories in here are pretty gruesome. CEASE, the Centre to End All Sexual Exploitation, has been a leader in Edmonton and Canada for over 20 years as an agency dedicated to reducing harm by sexual exploitation. As an advocate and honorary member of CEASE, I say we believe the exploitation of any one person diminishes the whole society. CEASE works for hope, respect, transformation for individuals, families, and communities. As CEASE celebrates 20 years of operation under the dedicated leadership of Kate Quinn, a number of best practices have been developed that I was thinking, holy cow, that could be a whole other workshop. Make a note for 2018, whatever. Best practices. But the best practice that CEASE, I think, is known for and has shaped CEASE is focus on the offender. And that's why I have a particular allegiance to Vector Malarick for reinforcing the belief that I started formulating many years ago. Offenders must be held accountable. It is significant that CEASE began with a prostitution offender program. As I mentioned before, this was an alternative measures program, but it was developed in cooperation with Vice, Solicitor General, and Crown prosecutors. Quite simply, it would not exist without legal sanction or structure. So we'd like to take the message to the men of the world, but we've been given kind of a voluntary captive audience. Anyway, the John School is a full-day educational program. I know a lot of people today were asking about the John School. It's full day. It's a full educational program. It informs participants about the reality of street life, pimping and trafficking, the dangers of STD, the role of addictions, the impact of soliciting on the community, and finally stories from survivors about their life and the impact on family members. And what is most gratifying about that program is that at the end of the day, most of the men seem to get it. Many will stand up and apologize and reassure us that they will change their behavior. Now, statistics have confirmed that very few are charged again. There's some question whether those are valid statistics, whether they move on to other things. We all know that when we're inspired, we have our what's the word? We're all inspired, and our motive, our intentions are the best at the time. But it is gratifying. Somebody asked me once, is it still helping you to go to the John School? And I said, I gave up doing it for myself long ago. I'm doing it because it seems to make a difference. It is gratifying that these men will stand up and say, oh my God, I didn't want to be here, but I am so glad I had the opportunity. I have learned so much. Thank you, ladies. It's amazing. Like, it truly is amazing that there are some men that are open to education, and it does seem to make a difference for them. So when I say focus on the offender, that doesn't mean shoot them. I mean, there's a few that I might, but I'm open to educating offenders. Educating the offenders of the city, one classroom at a time, has been a slow process. I would like to take the message to larger groups. I'm not sure how we're going to do that. That's still a vision. I'd like to speak at Kinsman and, wherever. But the city assures me that the men are being treated with discretion. So it's not going to happen through the body rubs. We know it takes time to change attitudes, and I'm always encouraged by a survivor who said, who would have thought a few years ago that smoking would ever be banned in bars? And yet, here we are today, smoke-free in all public places. Wouldn't it be wonderful to say to the world, Canada is exploitation-free in all public places? We have the federal legislation that could make it possible. Thank you. Our vision determines our political direction, and legislation can guide and inform our societal response. I would like to believe that most of the men in the world, well, at least 80%, going by the statistics, are decent, caring human beings who treat women in their lives with respect and consideration. Yet we also know from the beginning of time and in all cultures, there have also been a minority who choose to exploit women and children by turning them into sexual objects. Sanitized arguments in favor of liberalism tend to overlook the terrible costs and limited choices with which many women live. It is significant, though, that even the advocates who say, oh, we want liberal legislation, oh, but of course we're against coercion, of course we're against abuse, of course we're against trafficking, of course we're against violence, of course we're against pimping, of course we're against the exploitation of children. So that's the underneath part of the iceberg. So we have to be really careful about what we say about the top part of the iceberg, because that's where people are paying attention. The German author Ingeborg Kraus, it was really interesting. She was originally going to be here, so I thought, oh, I got to read Ingeborg just so I can do her credit. But oh my gosh, it was the most disturbing. She is really a disturbing author. Disturbing in that she's expressing the reality. The German reality is so disturbing. She talks about what she calls the banalization of sexuality, which, along with structural violence, growing brutality, and perversion among sex buyers, is the result of legalization. That's what legalization has done to Germany. The lady this afternoon said that there's 1 million users every day in Germany. Like, it's just unbelievable. The most disgusting acts can be pre-ordered online from a German menu in this legal system, and consumers. I'm calling it Fucken and Slurpen, my apologies to the German language, but like the things that we're describing, like Fistum Fukums, and like who, it's just who among us can truly believe that wanting or allowing someone to defecate in or on your body is a healthy act of free will. We know that trafficking is rampant in Germany, and this is what's happened because of legalization. Another growing concern in modern society is the explosion of internet pornography, which contributes to the objectification of women by, I give this one paragraph, and then I was thinking, make a note, another workshop for next time. The pornography becomes addictive when users crave more and different stimulation for their highs, just like any addiction. Pornography changes brain pathways so that users have difficulty with real-world relationships, and as they become more removed from real women, they opt for these distortions of artificial stimulation. This is a relatively new field of study with potentially serious implications, so it needs to be flagged. I just do not have the capacity or the time to get into it. I haven't studied enough. I just know that it's a contributing factor, and it cannot be overlooked. Okay, well, good. Chris was going to wave me at an hour, but that's okay. I said I think I'm good. In conclusion, I tried to speak from my spirit awareness, and I want to share another story that is not quite related to sexual exploitation, but it's related to imbalance and inequality. And a few years ago, I was a tourist in Atlanta, Georgia, and so one of the things I did was visit a plantation. And as we toured the manor house and the so-called slave quarters, I remember it struck me so forcefully that if there was this building that even now was clean and empty, and I said, oh my God, that's a barn. That is a barn. I grew up on a farm, so I know the difference between where people live and where animals were kept, and that was a barn. And I thought slaves didn't live in cabins, as folklore suggests. They were kept in barns. And that impact of that moment has never left me. And no wonder we have racial tension. I'm often impatient because I've lived with many painful realities and listened to many women's stories. And I have trouble watching the documentaries sometimes because of those kinds of images, but that's good because that's why the documents are made, is that hopefully a few of those images will stay with people and move them to further action. Not long ago, slavery was acceptable in America. Was it eliminated by a study of harm reduction? No. Oh, that would have been part of the blindness. Did the fight for freedom come from the oppressed? No, they were too focused on survival. Did the soldiers who fought for abolition postpone their battle until appropriate transition plans were in place for the soon-to-be liberated but homeless and jobless slaves? Of course not. Freedom was achieved, and then the difficult tasks of adjustment were addressed. Legislative and social change happens not from the protest of the oppressed, but because enlightened citizens have the courage to speak and act on behalf of their disadvantaged brothers and sisters. This is not truly complex, as one of the counselors stated. The work may be difficult, but I believe the principle is clear. Any normalization of sexual exploitation leads to negative consequences. Commodification breeds contempt. Beneath my anger is incredibly deep sadness that our sisters continue to be labeled in the name of harm reduction. And this reminds me of the common law rule of thumb. People, I think most people know that the rule of thumb in the common law was that a husband may beat his wife as long as the stick was no thicker than his thumb. And so there may be people that say, but didn't that prevent harm to some of the wives? Well, maybe it did, but only within the premise that abuse was acceptable. And I think we have to be careful that we don't fall into that trap. I believe we can do better. And even this week, and maybe it's because I was really sensitive, but I walked out of a meeting 2 weeks ago where I was there as an observer, but I felt trampled. It just, because it felt, and I had to really process that all day yesterday, and I'm thinking, like, what really got to me? But I think it was because people were talking about vulnerable women rather than for vulnerable women, and it just felt that they were being trivialized. And I thought, how many times do we have to sit through these conversations and be expected to come out gracious? And the answer is indefinitely. And so I'm still working on that. I felt my elder badge might be taken away because I was so angry yesterday. But so I've gone deep within myself over the last 18 years to find a place of compassion from which to educate Johns. And that's been fine. Like I did it, but I don't. And this is, I guess, where I don't expect to have to go to that same place when I'm dealing with my fellow professionals, who are supposedly sharing similar values and ethics, and that is so hurtful. And yet the conversation needs to continue because we're tripping over semantics, just like in the days of the treaty. And this harm reduction is a big one we're tripping over right now. So I met a lovely Aboriginal student yesterday who said, and I thought, oh, it was wonderful, the youth are teaching me. She said, we must strive to keep our hearts open and our minds clear. And so I was grateful for that reminder. And then I was thinking, well, I suppose the Christian response would be, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Journal columnist Paula Simons recently deplored, she wrote a scathing article about the jackals who make their fortunes exploiting the most economically marginalized. She was talking about payday loans. I wish we could hear similar passion on behalf of the sexually exploited. We have a new Prime Minister who affirms the equality of women across the country. Justin Trudeau created a gender-balanced cabinet because it was 2015. He proposed women's empowerment leads to equality as his theme for 2016. He claims to be a feminist who deplores gender-based violence and wants greater opportunities for all citizens. The more aligned we are, the more we can shape an international agenda. Those two are Justin's words. We're still waiting to hear how and if he will support the protection of exploited persons legislation. I once read that if 5% of the population has an idea, it is embedded. If 20% of the population has an idea, it is unstoppable. Unfortunately, pornography is gaining, and we need to find a way to counter the negative forces of objectification and to champion the human rights of all citizens to be free from exploitation. We need to make economic security, personal integrity, and sexual freedom an unstoppable force. Oh yeah, there was another quote I got from the Alberta Health Services wellness site. It says, emotions come and go like waves. You cannot stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. So I was trying to be a surfing elder here. So a couple quotes and I'm done. Khalil Gibran said, you are good when you walk toward your goal firmly and with bold steps. Yet you are not evil when you go forward limping. Even those who limp do not go backward. But you who are strong and weak, see that you do not limp before the lame, deeming it a kindness. Maya Angelou, as I quoted earlier, said, "When we know better, we do better." And Anne Frank said, "How wonderful it is that no one need to wait a single moment before starting to improve the world." Please join me in making the abolition of sexual exploitation an unstoppable idea. Please join me in a quest to rediscover and protect the sacredness of sexual expression, which involves intimacy, caring, tenderness, respect, and love. Thank you. Thank you very much. What do you want to do? Anyway, Chris is going to moderate questions. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy. I know I covered a lot of material. I'm happy to elaborate, whatever. Go ahead.
On your tables, you'll notice in the center there are little brightly colored cards. You write down your questions on those.
Or we're a friendly group. If people, I think we're a friendly group. If people want to, yeah, you want to speak,
That'll give people a little bit of time.
yeah, people, take your time.
Want me to run the microphone around?
Okay. We've got, whoops, I'm moving here, surfing. We've got half an hour. I know it's been an incredibly long day. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Okay, sure, we'll do that. Just before we start, so we are going to, we're inviting people to write a few questions. Is Dorian still here?
She said she had to leave early.
Okay, I will, I'll put your hand up and then I'll come around and get your question. And I would like to welcome Chris Yang Chen Phillips. And in case you don't know this, he is both a storyteller and a people weaver. And our city has just appointed him our 4th historian laureate. So let's recognize that. And Chris wants to bring forth some of the stories of the people who've been invisible in Edmonton. So I look forward to hearing those histories. Edmonton is the first city to create the position of historian laureate. And Kathy, you gave us some of the history today, so thank you very much.
Yeah, I skimmed it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we do have a strong history. So I will come around and pick up any questions you want to go.
Okay, that sounds
take a
good. I'll
break
take
and
my
sit
water.
down.
I'll take my feet are killing me.
Anybody have a
Yeah, thanks so much. I will lead off with a question while you guys are processing. You mentioned that you've had many conversations with women who are selling sex through CESE. What's one of the more impactful conversations you've had over the years?
I guess the two ladies that I mentioned, one, my friend Juanita, who was socialized in challenging circumstances from a very young age. So she was groomed by people before she really had a chance to weigh her own circumstances. So that there's a tragedy in that, and we don't know how many people around the world are in that kind of similar situation, whether they're sold by their family in India, whether they're sent from Slavic nations in the hope of a better life, whether the lady today mentioned the people who are being pimped from Asia with promises of jobs, and so that whole duplicity. You asked for one, but I'm doing an amalgamation. The duplicity with which people are lured into exploitation is one of the most impactful things. And then I think the other impactful thing is the other lady I quoted that who I didn't mention her name, who says that like every time she was exploited, it was if a piece of her was taken away, and she too, like Rachel Moran, is an articulate lady who was able to get out, but that the impact of that description, that she said, I told a lie many times a day to the point that I didn't know who I was anymore. So I think those are kind of the two extremes, which, I mean, my own experience, the vulnerabilities that all came together in one small child in my experience, but I guess that's the third part of it is we have to recognize the addictions that make people vulnerable, the mental health issues that make people vulnerable, the social environment, the vulnerability of youth, where you're hanging out with friends who don't necessarily have your best interest at heart. All of those things. Yeah, sorry, more than one.
Yeah. The accumulated experience of many conversations. Yeah. Do we have some questions coming up from the audience? Fantastic.
Maybe we'll start with this one because you just talked about Karen. Okay, sure.
All right. Question is, did the police ever charge your daughter's killer?
No, he's never been found. He's never been identified. It's an unsolved case. So I suspect, I probably shouldn't say this, I suspect Thomas Svekla may have been may be responsible, but I'll never know. Nobody will ever confirm that. He was charged with 2 murders, Rachel Quinney and Teresa Ennis. He was acquitted of Rachel Quinney and convicted of Teresa Ennis. So he is spared being labeled as a convicted or as a serial killer because he has only been charged with 1 murder. Or convicted of 1 murder, I should say. But no, my daughter is one of the many, by my counts, we'll go with the 40. Well, there was, in that 20-year period, there was at least 40 women who were labeled as high risk, who have disappeared off the face of the earth. For me, the missing month was probably one of the most difficult months of my life, but I have met a few other women over the years whose daughters have never been found, and I just cannot imagine how horrible, how much more worse, how much more horrible it is for them to never know. Years and years and years go by and their daughters are still unsolved. So I say sometimes I was grateful that my daughter was solved. For the first couple years, I waited. I just assumed that one day the police would say, "Hey, Kathy, we just want to give you a heads up. You know, we made an arrest. It'll be on the news tonight, whatever." And then I used to think, "Oh my God, like, what am I going to do? How am I going to go to court? Like, am I going to have to take holidays? Am I going to have to take a leave of absence? Because I mean, I was working." All these things that you sort of go through your mind, but it never happened. And so now, as much as I would like justice to happen, I don't know that I want to sit through a court experience. I'm kind of hoping that I get a jailhouse confession or something, and whatever they'll tell me, you know, somebody confessed, but he's dying, so we're not going to go to court. I don't know. It's never been solved. There's many murders in Edmonton that have never been solved.
Yeah, and that's a story that I know you've told a lot, and we appreciate you sharing it again. Yeah. This is a good word, because you mentioned that you dislike the word prostitution. So the question is, why do you dislike that word? And then there's a follow-up question after that we'll get to.
The reason I dislike the word is just because it's been overused and it doesn't mean anything. It's legally defined as the exchange of sexual services, and if people are doing that in a freely consenting manner, then I'm okay with that. But I prefer the word sexual exploitation because I think it explains the more realistic and the bigger reality.
Thank you. And the follow-up question that this person had was, what is the outcome of the Nordic model where it's been implemented?
Well, I think the big clearest, what was the word? The outcome is that sexual services are lessened in countries where the Nordic model is enforced. There is less incidence. Now, unfortunately, like in Sweden, they go down the whatever, I don't know, Danube or whatever to Germany. And so in fact, we're in Germany where it is legalized, the brothels, or I mean the trafficking, it's multiplied beyond what anybody ever expected. So yeah, short answer is enforcing the Nordic model, exploitation goes down. Legalized sexual exploitation opens the door to horrible trafficking and horrible, it just opens the door to so much more crime, trafficking, coercion, pimping, banalization, all of those things I talked about that are part of the German experience. It's shocking and disturbing.
You mentioned some of the conversations about whether this law is too liberal or too conservative, or how it fit into that. This next question addresses that. How do you think we should work toward restoring the respect and integrity of the human body without being, quote, too religious or, quote, too liberal?
Oh, that's a very good question. Thank you. Okay, wow. Well, I don't like using the word religious either. A lot of people today use the word spirit. I do believe that, like just as in the medicine wheel, we're body, soul, mind, and spirit, heart, emotion. You know, if we deny our spiritual part, we are denying a part of ourselves. And so that if we can, we can't limit ourselves. Okay, maybe do you want to read it again? Sorry.
Yeah. How do we work towards what you'd mentioned about restoring the integrity of the human body without being too religious or too...
Okay. Yeah, so to look at our totality, to be spiritual. Yeah, we all know that religion is a set of external constructs. Our spirituality is our internal self, our relationship to our Creator, our relationship to our fellow human beings, our relationship to the earth, all of those things that make us unique, that give us creativity, that give us love, that give us relationship, that's all part of our spirit. And so to embrace our sexuality as part of our total expression, I don't think involves religion necessarily.
It's quite a balance. The next question is, what would or could it look like to educate our youth about sexual exploitation in the school systems? What would need to happen for something to be developed and implemented? And maybe as a follow-up to that, wouldn't it be great if we could do that work before the men become Johns?
Absolutely. And so how do we engage men? Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I mean, I'll do the red dresses. I was just with Mufti yesterday at a school in the West End that had a 2-week cultural awareness program that was engaging both the men and the women. And so they were talking about the missing and murdered women. So I think we need to start with reality. Like these are this is part of our reality. This is part of our this is part of what's happening. I believe that well, I guess because there's enough healthy men in my life, and then I look, okay, so how are they raising their kids? Well, they're raising them by teaching them values, by keeping them busy. Like, and I think I've said to Kate sometimes, like, you know, if I have to choose sometimes between going to a hockey game or giving a talk, like, I mean, if the hockey games are building the healthy youth of the kids, so there's so many ways. Like when I'm going and supporting my grandchildren in all of their activities, and sometimes. You know, it's, you know, I mean, I got to admit, like watching junior hockey isn't my favorite activity, but I mean, we need to do all these things to support, to give our children a wide experience of life and healthy relationships and team building and competitiveness. that's respectful and that doesn't create a war between the sexes. So there are a lot of good programs, I think, in the schools. I haven't been in schools for a long time. Sometimes we need to do extra awareness things. I mean, I know there's like career and life management classes and all of that, and I think the agenda just needs to be there. It needs to be included. Somebody talked about putting consent into agendas. What does consent mean? What does respect mean? What is a healthy relationship? Well, somebody asked as well if sexual relationships are covered in the John School. I know John Walker that said, well, not really, but they are. I mean, there is an hour on healthy sexual relationships that. So I mean, that's the kind of thing that could be taken into the schools too. And like the lady that was talking about the program said, you teach it universally. You don't teach it just to children at risk. You teach them what is a healthy relationship, what is respectful caring, and what John Walker mentioned this morning for those who were here, like that we have to recognize that boys are often socialized in harmful ways, that they're really, the emphasis is put on production and doing well professionally and accumulating and being successful, and there isn't a lot of socialization around how to form healthy relationships. And so we just need to be creative and come up with ways to do that and teach that to the boys, at all levels.
And that's a part of the Ontario sex ed curriculum now, right? Is teaching consent. Yeah, so that's one model. This next question is, how do we bring forward the stories of the silent, the invisible, or the otherwise marginalized, exploited women or young men without sensationalizing or further exploiting them for those stories? That's a big question.
Oh, yeah, that's a very good question, and I know that's a question I've often asked even for myself, because I remember sometimes I think I should just let my daughter rest in peace, and then I met one of her friends once, and she said, oh no, she always liked to help people, so she'd want you to continue. I think, okay. So we don't want to marginalize people. There are some very brave people who have chosen to identify themselves and speak their own stories. And I think, we definitely don't want to exploit people. And I was going to say some of the documentaries. I've walked out of documentaries too, because some of the documentaries are exploitive. No, Juanita's nodding. She was. I was chafing at the bit there one time. We were at this Women's Awareness Day, and I'm thinking, this is an aside. I've been to a couple documentaries that I have found so offensive, and I remember that same place, Garneau's great for that, and I remember this one guy saying, what did you think of the documentary? I said, I thought it was terrible. He says, she's a well-known filmmaker. I said, I don't care. I thought she did a terrible job. She exploited. She was supposed to be creating sympathy, and she presented the material in an exploitive way, and I just do not think that's necessary. So yes, I know. So I mean, I'm agreeing. I'm not answering the question. We do need to find ways of telling the stories without exploiting individuals. Juanita has an idea. Great, thank you.
You know what we get lots of people coming to us, because I work with streets for 20 years. I get people all the time. Will you come and share your story? But what pisses me off is they want to hear the sad story, and they want to hear the abusive part, but they never want to share the healing part.
Yeah.
And they never want to share ways of resources after. So I'm proud to say
Yeah.
I just did a video called A Safe Place.
Yes.
A few barefoot and native counseling services. I'm so proud of that video, because they told 3 stories of 3 Aboriginal women, an elderly and another lady, 3 walks of lives. We shared a story of how we got started and how we got out, but they also showed us picking sweetgrass and smudging. I was so proud they showed me smudging, because it's about healing, right? And then they talked right after. They showed resources on the video, and then after they did a poem for Aboriginal women. I have never been so proud. And I'm tired of people exploiting for the stories. Let's get the healing. And don't just exploit for the story and walk
Yeah.
She exploited her for the video. She made the video. She walked off. Never went to check on the girl. Never went back. That girl relapsed, and she had issues because now she opened up something that was so deep for your pleasure, but what about her own? And see, I also think about my children. My children are at the age where I can share. But when they were younger, I never did any. Kate and I always were aware of what interviews I was doing, but it's not about me. It's also about my children. So I do go into schools and I do share my stories. Cease does go into schools, and believe me, I have no shame to my game. And when it comes to working with my youth, I tell them how it is. And when it comes to raising young boys, we gotta teach these boys. Women are not bitches in homes. And young men, it's just, it happens. And you're right, you gotta make money. But what about those healthy relationships? So I think we need to do a little bit more work with men. And it's not about men exploiting women. We also have women exploiting women. And that is huge. In the safe houses, we've got girls coming out exploiting other girls. And I'm fighting that fight too.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, it's your
No, that's okay. Thank you. Thank you. I learned so much from Juanita, and I'm so proud of your spirit of survival. And we're a great tag team. Yeah. Juanita says, I don't do this for money. I say, well, but I do. well, let me tell you about how CESA is funded. So it's.
She may have lost her daughter, but she loves me like her own. And she's teaching me to raise my daughter. And you know what she said to me? I'm sorry.
Oh, I can say this.
She says, I wish we can listen more and argue less. I need to listen more and argue less. She said those and I've been taking that with me, and every time I have to deal with my 24-year-old daughter with disability, I listen more and argue less. Kathy has made me a better mother. And I'm grateful.
Thank you. And I think that's what we need to focus on. We need to focus on what gives us our own strength. How do we define our own spirit? I'm talking about the elders. How do we define healthy family life? So that the more we focus on what is good, the more, we're building in the resources, and what is less good becomes more obvious in contrast. Does that make sense? Yeah, thank you.
As a journalist, I worry about the exploitation question all the time. Thank you for the reminder of how important that is. In your knowledge, has anything ever been tried outside massage parlors to discourage men from buying sex? Any brochures specifically for men buying sex in parlors? I think this is talking about like things that men might see as they enter.
No, I don't know about that. I just know from reading Victor Malarich's work that men say they would be deterred by being identified. This is why I find it so interesting that the city has promised them discretion. The men say that they would be discouraged by charges. Most of the work that the men do, they do in secret. As Victor Malarich says, the only place they're really honest, interestingly, is with the women. And so some of his stories are secondhand. And the other place they are quite free about their motives is on the internet, so that if you can get into the Anonymous John's websites or whatever. I've never tried, but that's where Victor Malarich got a lot of his stuff, and so that's where they talk about what they want and where to get it and how to do it and all this kind of nonsense. But the underlying theme, I think, is that they do it in secret, and they will boast to each other, and they will talk to each other about how to get it and where to get it, but they do not want to be publicly identified for the most part. So to me, that's pretty obvious. We talk about registering the women. Why not register the men? Why if you put them on Kijiji? Yeah, really. I mean, man wants to whatever, willing to pay, and then see if he gets any response. Yeah, they don't want to be identified. The way back, there have been, I think there have been sites occasionally where people have tried to name Johns, but I mean the John School, I mean they're given, we too treat them with discretion and respect because that's part of the deal with the Crown. But and I mean I'm not disagreeing with the. That's part of why we get the captive audience. They're not identified. There's been discussions with the newspapers and stuff over the years, but for the most part, the city has chosen not to identify them.
It's interesting that we have this image of the sex trade as being something that happens exclusively in public, but so much of it happens online. Maybe it's more about banner ads than brochures. We're going to try to get through one more question, and then we'll let you guys all head home for the evening, which is, can you comment on the survey that found that men would not be deterred even if they knew that women were trafficked versus the compassionate response from men at the end of the John School Alternative Measures program? How can we aim towards a better response, or the latter response? And I'm sorry for those of you who contributed questions that we weren't able to get to. Thank you all for submitting those.
Okay, I guess we were talking about two different things. One was the study. Why are you doing it, and would you be deterred if you knew women were trafficked? And they say no. And that's reflected in Victor Malarich's book as well, that the men that he has studied and quoted say, and it doesn't really matter to me, I'm paying my money, and whether, however they got to where they are, I'm paying my money and I expect my service. So one of the really disturbing things in the Johns is there is a site where you can even do, how would you describe it? Sadism by proxy. I just cannot believe it. So if you really want to see women punished, but you don't want to leave the comfort of your own home, you can order it on video. And can you believe it? Yeah, and Juanita's shaking her head. Like some of the things, when you start looking at it, when you start looking at the underneath, the belly of the iceberg, this stuff is so disgusting, and it's just mind-boggling. Like I just could not believe, sadism by proxy. Like, oh my God, and that there are actually people who have, well, we can't say recruited, who have trafficked, who have somehow enslaved these women, and one of the pimps that he quotes is saying that he likes to. Because one of the particular appeals to him, being a sadistic pimp, is that he can punish the girls if they don't perform to his satisfaction. So I mean, this is part of the underbelly. I'm sorry, people. It's so vast. It's so. It's just mind-boggling, and it's sort of like looking at the barns at the plantation. We just cannot really fully comprehend the depravity that part of the world lives in, and I have trouble going there myself sometimes, and I have trouble watching the good documentaries, but I mean, the good documentaries are good because hopefully they're making people think. So that's the difference. What was the difference was the question. The difference is he's doing a study. The Johns that we talk to, well, first of all, we have to, if you have a history of violence, if the Johns have a history of violence, they're not eligible for the alternative measures program. So in a way, we're getting the better Johns, if there is such, well, there is such a thing. We're not getting, because we know there's sadistic Johns. As I described briefly, there's Johns that want particular sex acts. There's Johns that want power and control. There's Johns that are kind of pathetic and lonely, and that they just want a relationship. So there's a whole range of Johns, and the ones that we get in the John School, I would say, are the less hardened Johns. Probably we do get a few that are. It was John Walker said, what did he say, 1 out of 15 maybe, or something, that seems to have psychopathic tendencies. So for the most part, we're getting men who are, it's their first arrest, So they haven't really learned maybe the whole way of navigating the underground. And they're men who are eligible for court diversion because they don't have a lot of other offenses, and they're our captive audience for whatever. I mean, they come, but they choose it, but they choose to sit for 8 hours and listen, and and we generally have the vice police there. So if they're not listening politely, they're either asked to leave or given the equivalent of a swat on the back of the head, and or Renita kind of calls them to attention sometimes, and. So the point is they get it. Like most of them get it. There's always a few. I remember one guy. Like there's a few that don't get it. I remember one guy. This a couple years ago because we always ask him for feedback, and he says, "Oh, you're being kind of tough on pimps. They're just trying to make a living too." So okay, he didn't get it. Most of them get it. Yeah. I see. I mean, yeah. So there are a few that don't get it in the John School, but we try and keep positive, and most of them do. Like it is amazing. Like they've never had to sit and listen for 8 hours, and some of them say like, "Oh my God, you've just told me things that nobody's ever told me this. I never thought about it. I never thought beyond what I wanted, and now I see a whole new reality." And I saved myself a criminal record. I had to spend 8 days with you lovely 8 hours with you lovely ladies, and a lot of them say, I'm glad it happened. So yeah.
All right. Thanks so much, Kathy. And then we have something from Kate.